Hello, and welcome to EURAXESS Smart Talks.
The Smart Talks podcast series is an EU-funded EURAXESS project which provides information and assistance to researchers at any career stage.
EURAXESS supports the EU research area in its ambition to create a single borderless market for research, innovation and technology in the EU.
We support researchers in mobility, careers within and outside academia, innovation and entrepreneurship.
We strive to increase scientific collaboration between Europe and the world. Hi, I'm Daria, a senior expert at EURAXESS National Contact Point in Latvia.
And I'm Jovan, a teaching and research assistant from the Faculty of Mechanical Engineering in Niš, Serbia.
And you are listening to the EURAXESS Smart Talks podcast.
Today, we start our episode with Dr. Marina Joubert. She is a leading expert in science communication, currently serving as a senior researcher at the Center of Research on Evaluation, Science and Technology at the Stellenbosch University, with a background in food science, journalism, agricultural science. She has dedicated her career to understanding how scientists engage with the public and how science is represented in the media. Her work has earned her prestigious accolades, including an STF Award for Science Outreach and the Honorary Life Membership in the Public Communication Science and Technology Network.
Beyond academia, Dr. Joubert has played a pivotal role in shaping science communication in Africa. Having managed the first online course in the field on the continent, she is a vocal advocate against pseudoscience and misinformation, actively promoting evidence-based discourse. Her research explores the visibility of scientists in society, the dynamics of public trust in science, and the evolving landscape of science communication in the digital age. Hello, Marina. Thank you very much for joining us, and you are super welcome on the podcast.
Hello, Daria. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about science communication.
So tell us, please, a little bit about yourself. How and why you decided to be a researcher?
Well, for me, it was a difficult choice when I had to study as a young student, between writing and between science, because I loved both worlds. And I'm very grateful that I was able to combine it. So I studied science first, microbiology, food science, chemistry. And then I was able to do a postgraduate course in journalism at Stellenbosch University. And that combination of having studied science and journalism really opened up an opportunity for me to move into writing, but writing about science. And then I worked for many years for South Africa's National Research Foundation, who is funding science. And I convinced them over time, it took a bit of hard work, but I convinced them that we shouldn't only write about deadlines and calls and, new opportunities. We should write about the science that the scientists are actually doing with the funding that they get and what it means to society. And I became super interested in this science and society interface and how scientists can make their work more accessible, more visible, more meaningful to the audiences that they're doing the science for. Because after all, much of science is done for the public good. And I realized that in South Africa, we didn't really have any opportunities for people to study further in this specific field, science communication or public engagement with science. So over time, I started talking to universities locally and said, there are many universities around the world that offer these courses. We are lagging behind, and students come to me and ask, where can they study this? And they cannot afford to go to London or, America to study it. So over time, it took quite a long time, but eventually now we have actually 4 universities in South Africa that offer some kind of science communication or science engagement program. And I'm very excited about that. And I hope that it will grow even more also in other countries in Africa.
That's very interesting. And you said that you were considering different options at the start between writing and research. What was the main tipping point? Why did you choose science communication in the end?
To be very honest, I think it was simply that idea that I wanted science to get out of the lab. And I wanted the science to, to talk to people about it. I realized that even my own family didn't understand much about what I was doing. So I was really interested in that, we're doing all this amazing work and it stays just locked up in academic journals. What can we do to change that? And it was in the 1980s, 1990s, I became increasingly aware of these movements around the world, especially in the UK at that time, that they called public understanding of science. And it was a big movement, and a lot of policy documents came out where top people in government said, we cannot afford for scientists to be isolated from society. We have to change this. And also in South Africa at the time, we were going through a difficult time politically. And towards the end of apartheid, and when a new democratic South Africa was born, our new government really said that science was one of the ways they wanted to improve people's lives. So from a political point of view, the government said that they wanted to promote scientific literacy. They wanted to promote interactions between science and society. So that also gave me another opportunity to become a part of that movement and to work with other scientists on some of the early initiatives in South Africa, and the ability to offer training, sometimes short courses, but later I was able to then offer a full master's program and PhD programs in science communication. That all took a lot of time, but it's wonderful to see how it has changed over the last 20 to 30 years, and where we are now, that science communication is more established. Even now, there's clear policy support for public engagement with science in South Africa. It is written into the Act of Parliament of our National Research Foundation that scientists must engage with society. Our government departments also support it. So political support is important, of course, but then you still have to make it happen on a practical level, and you still have to find the ways to do it, to make a real difference in society.
Uh, on this side, how you think this theory of science communication and practice actually could be combined in real life?
So, Dara, the bridge between science communication, research or theory and practice is a key issue, because we have now, over the last 10 to 20 years, established quite a considerable body of evidence of what works and what doesn't work in science communication. And science communication as a field of research draws on social psychology, on behavioral science, on communication science, and we try to understand why people respond in specific ways, and why it's not necessarily enough to just give people a lot of facts. I mean, one of the key trends in our field, I think, is, yes, facts are important and we have to give people information, but that's not enough. If you just bombard people with facts, they're not necessarily going to see it your way. They're not necessarily going to agree with what you say, because people don't necessarily respond to new knowledge on a rational basis. They respond to new knowledge on the way they feel, and the way they feel is determined by their prior experiences and their worldviews and their identities. So scientists have become to realize, who work in this field, that we have to engage with society. Scientists also have to listen. They have to be willing to listen to society. They have to try to understand, why are people hesitant about vaccines, or why do people not believe the evidence for climate change, for example? Those are just two examples. There are many more. So for me, that bridge between research and practice is crucial. And there are very many networks and journals in the field that try to achieve that try to say, let's bridge research and practice. Let's make sure that all the new information we have as researchers are actually made available to practitioners, and vice versa, that the research is also informed by real world problems of the practitioners. I'm also a deputy editor of a journal called JCOM, or Journal of Science Communication, and we specifically publish not only research but also practice insights. So we also invite practitioners to publish in our journal and tell us about their experiences and what they need from research. I think that's really, really important, and we still have a lot more work to do there. There is one other aspect that I would like to highlight in terms of my own career journey, coming from the natural sciences and moving over to science communication. When many students who come to us who want to study science communication come from the natural science disciplines, and sometimes they are very excited about science. They're almost like, science has got all the answers. Science is the solution to all the problems. Science will find the answers. But when you move into science communication, you actually become a social scientist. And you have to accept that as a social scientist, you have to be a little bit more, well, actually quite a bit more reflexive and sometimes even critical about science. And you also have to accept that science may not actually have all the answers. That is why we have to be more tolerant of different worldviews, also of indigenous knowledge systems. That is also why you have to be humble enough and willing to listen to society, to engage with local communities, to think about different ways of seeing the world and different ways of knowing. So it's actually quite a journey to become a social scientist if you start out in the natural sciences, if you study science communication.
Thank you very much, Marina, for your answer. Let us speak about the theoretical aspects like models of science communication, deficit, dialogue, and engagement. How would you explain these models exist and how it could help us understand practical side of science communication?
No, I will try to respond. I think the first thing I would like to say is that the models of science communication, from deficit to dialogue to engagement and even to co-creation, we now agree, I think, more or less, that these models coexist and overlap, and they are all necessary. In different conditions and different times, we need different approaches to science communication. And I also want to emphasize that my view of the deficit model is not that it's necessarily wrong. Sometimes you need to provide people with information. Sometimes one-way communication is required, especially during a time of crisis. So the deficit model has a place, but what is a problem is when you expect that people will simply believe you, when you just accept that I'm going to give them all these facts and nobody is going to have a problem with any of it. That's where the problem lies. It's not with giving the information. So that's why we say, yes, give people information. There's a moral duty on scientists to share their knowledge, but whenever possible, and find ways and create ways to also then have a dialogue with the public, to hear how they feel about it, to understand how they respond to it, to understand maybe why they don't necessarily agree. Then if you have a dialogue, you can think about going a step further, which is really hard to do, but to engage people in actually co-creating knowledge and participating in the process of science. So all of these things are, like you say, they are evolutionary, but I don't think the deficit model is ever going to go away. And I don't think we should necessarily give it a bad name. It really has a place, and it has to coexist with all these other models. You should not have the deficit only. But what I do really agree with you very much is that we should talk about more about the process of science, so that the public understands that scientists often disagree with one another, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. When they challenge each other, they are forced to rethink and debate and go back and check again. That is why it's often, I think about it, that's why it's called research. Search again, look again, interrogate, discuss, debate. These things are good. Also, we have done studies on trust in science, which have showed us that when scientists talk openly about uncertainty, for example, or the fact that they still have to do more work before they will be able to give a definitive answer, or even admit that not everybody agrees, that actually helps the public to understand how science works in the first place, but also it actually builds trust. You may think that I have to appear as the expert who knows everything if I want people to trust me, but actually we found that people trust you more when you're willing to admit that you are just a human being, you are searching for answers, you're willing to share your own feelings, you're willing to admit frankly and openly that there are some things you still don't know. That is much more conducive to trust building than appearing to say I have all the answers.
And I really like your answer. Again, you also mentioned the trust in vaccines and science in general. So, for someone who is not in the field of science communication, as I am not, what does research in trust, or better said, distrust in science mean? What are the results, and how can they be interpreted or used for future work? Are there any tips and tricks you can give to researchers on how to apply this?
Thank you for that question, Jovan. So there are several groups around the world at the moment working on this topic of trust in science. And I think it is in response to a perceived loss of trust in science. I think there's the perception in the scientific community that there's growing mistrust of science or distrust of science. Actually, interestingly, across a number of different projects, we see that that's not actually the case. When we do these surveys with large public audiences, a study that I recently participated in had 1,000 respondents across 68 countries, so more than 1,000 people in each of these 68 countries. And we conclusively showed that trust in science is still moderately high to high in most of these countries. It's lower in some parts of the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. There is some concern about lower levels of trust. But generally speaking, we don't really have evidence of a loss of public trust in science. But I think what has happened is that people who are anti-science, who have, doubts about science, who are maybe really have different views about vaccines or climate change or genetically modified foods, these groups, they may be in the small minority in society, but they are very vocal, and they are very expert at communication, and they're very skilled at using social media channels. So they have been able to amplify their views and voices, and this has made scientists concerned, because there's this perception now that there's this very large and vocal and active anti-science agenda. And of course, we have to take note of that, and we have to engage with that, not necessarily to fight with them, but just to have the other side of the debate also heard. So my advice always to young scientists is, yes, sometimes it may feel a little bit disheartening to see anti-science and sort of pseudoscience and sort of false claims out there. But if scientists don't participate in the debate in social media and in the public domain, then those anti-science views and voices will be the only ones that will be heard. So at least as scientists, I think we have a collective responsibility to speak out, to take part in this dialogue, and to also put the other side of the debate. And to talk about evidence, but also to understand, as I said earlier, that people don't necessarily just want evidence and facts. So the tips that we have from studying trust in science, and the scientists that build trust with society, is personalize the science. Bring yourself into the story. If you're a climate change scientist, for example, don't just talk about it coldly and abstractly and neutrally. Talk about your own journey. Why did you become a climate scientist? What are your own concerns about the future of our planet? What do you think that people can do? Sort of make it personal. And the other piece of advice that's sort of linked to that is show empathy with your audience. Try to understand why people feel a certain way. Don't don't discard people, or don't just reject their views. Try to understand, try to have a constructive dialogue with them. So bring warmth and empathy and personalization into your communication. And that all comes down to making an emotional connection with your audience. So give them the facts, that's important, but also the arguments, why you believe what you believe, and also the emotional connection. I can maybe quickly tell a story here. Early in my career, I listened to a talk that really influenced me, where a colleague at Stellenbosch University talked about the early Greek philosophers, and he specifically talked about Aristotle, who had three pillars of rhetoric, and it was the logos, ethos, and
Ethos.
pathos.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I still use that so much. So the logos is all the all the logic, all the facts. The ethos is the arguments, why you believe these things. But the pathos, which is the third leg of that three-legged stool, is to have that emotional connection, the warmth. And if we think that some of these insights are new, but actually it dates back to ancient times, that we need all three. You need the facts, you need the arguments, but you also need the emotional connection if you want to build trust, and if you want to really have a dialogue with an audience that's meaningful. And you also have to be willing to listen. So don't just take over as the expert, be willing to listen.
Thank you, Marina. And on the side of data, what would be your advice? How we interpret the data of science believers, deniers, or about even microbial resistance, for example? Do we need to differentiate between those who know about it, are ignorant about it, and those who are completely wrong, for example?
Yeah, I think the knowledge about, for the specific example that you give about antibiotics and whether it kills viruses or bacteria or both, I mean, obviously, that's a very good example of a basic piece of understanding of science that can help people to make more informed decisions. And that's why I said earlier, we always will need the deficit model. Sometimes you really need to just help people to understand how something specific works, and why it's not helpful to take antibiotics if you have a viral cold, for example. So if they have to empower them with that information. But at the same time, when you tell people to don't use antibiotics unnecessarily, you have to understand that there may be many other reasons why they want to use antibiotics. And even if they understand that it's only, effective for bacteria, they may still not necessarily follow your advice. And then it becomes quite complex, because now you have to understand, what if I give them the facts, why are they still insisting on antibiotics when they have flu? And that's where you have to have dialogue. There may be experiences that they've had before that it did help when they had flu. They may have heard something from their friends or neighbors. They may simply be scared that they won't be able to get antibiotics in future, and they want to keep some for in case they need it. There are many reasons why people will simply not respond to the information we give them. But antimicrobial resistance is a big problem that is going to get even worse, according to the scientific predictions, over the next few decades. And it's a big issue that we have to address. It's probably going to be a much more serious issue for the global society. Everybody in the whole world is going to be affected by antimicrobial resistance. So it's a very good example that you picked, a topic that I'm also very interested in, and I'm actually working on with some other scientists, is why are we not doing better at communicating about AMR or antimicrobial resistance? And there are many reasons probably why. It's a complex topic. It's difficult for people to understand. People don't see it as a disease like COVID. AMR is a much more complex, cross-cutting issue. When somebody dies from a resistant infection, it doesn't necessarily say that they died of AMR. It says, they died of pneumonia or whatever. So people don't see it as such a problem. They see it as somebody else's problem or a distant problem. So AMR, or antimicrobial resistance, is I think personally, one of the biggest challenges for health communicators in the next 10 to 20 years. And it's a topic that, we can maybe have a separate conversation about, because I've actually just finished a review on this topic of the communication challenges and looking at the potential solutions. What can we possibly do collectively as a scientific community to address antimicrobial resistance? But it's a big topic. But just in principle, it's a good example of, we need facts, but we need to follow it up with dialogue and understanding.
How do you think scientists can be attracted to communicate? Are there any incentives which you think should be applied, or practices?
You have a very important question. So part of my research, I focused on what are the factors that influence whether scientists are willing to communicate and engage or not. Because we see across countries and across disciplines that there are some scientists that are just natural communicators. They are storytellers. They love the opportunity to talk to society. They always say yes when journalists approach them. And then there are other scientists who say, not for me. I don't want to do this. Leave me alone. I became a scientist to focus on my work. And my personal opinion is that we should leave these two extremes alone. The natural communicators are doing it in any case, with or without incentives. We don't have to worry about them. They're doing a great job. The ones who really don't want to do it, there are reasons why. Maybe their field is just purely abstract or highly sensitive or really theoretical, and they just don't feel comfortable. And maybe it's better to let them be. But they are also a small minority. The biggest group of scientists we should work with are those in the middle who are interested potentially, but they may not know why or how to do it. They may need some encouragement. So personally, I think the biggest difference, and that I've seen also in practice, comes when funders begin to include science communication and public engagement in their funding calls, and also when they ask researchers to report back. So I think funders should, and many funders are already doing this, including some funding from the EU and funding from big research funders around the world. They're beginning to say, okay, we don't want the science to just stay locked up in academia. We want society to benefit from it. So they are asking scientists, when they apply for funding, tell us, what are you going to do to make this more accessible and visible to society? And then they get scientists to report back on that. But importantly, it's a good thing to do that, and I think the funders can make a big difference, but they should then also provide some support for the scientists who want to do it, some encouragement, some training, some networks where they can get help. And when the scientists report back, there should be some evidence of that they've used funding for that. Ideally, I believe the funding for the communication and engagement should be ring-fenced, because if it's just part of the big budget, scientists may still not actually use the money for engagement or really spend that effort. But I think there are things that scientists themselves can do, but I also believe that really sometimes they do need help, because scientists have already so much to do. They've got to do the research, the supervision, the teaching, the grant applications, the administration. Scientists are overwhelmed in many cases by all the work they have to do. So when I train young scientists, I always tell them, if you put it in your budget of your project from the start, if you think about communication and engagement even before you start the project, not at the end when you've got the results, right at the beginning, when you apply for funding or when you plan a project, if you build it into the plan and you build it into the budget, then you can budget to get a little bit of help from an illustrator or a videographer or a podcaster or a designer or a translator. So think about those things from the start. Who should I make this? Who are my audience? Who should I make this available to? How will I engage with them? And make that part of your plan. Then you can be sure that it will happen, and you can also get help, because I really don't think scientists can do it all alone. Science communication has become a very sophisticated and technical thing, with all the social media channels, with the media changing so fast. So I really think that scientists can go much further if they are the experts for the content, the actual messages, but they get communication professionals to help them with actually doing the communication and engagement. So funders and help, I think those are the two things I would say. And of course, it helps a lot if institutions like universities also acknowledge the importance and recognize the scientists who go the extra mile to encourage them, recognize them, maybe have a science communication prize or some small awards inside the institution. And of course, if institutions themselves make help available inside, let the researchers know, here are people who can help you. If you want to do a press release, if you want to write for the conversation, if you want to have a community event, scientists are much more willing to engage if they get help and if they get the platforms to do it.
And you raise an excellent point regarding the balance between everyday science work and science communication. I understand one of the solution, as you just emphasized, that is outsourcing. But do you also have some tips and tricks for scientists themselves who want to do this part of the work on how to balance it with their everyday research work?
So one thing I would say is to ask yourself, why did I start this research project in the first place? And obviously academic outputs are important, publishing in highly cited, peer-reviewed journals. We know how important that is. But surely you want to do more than that. And I think if scientists think about the communities that can benefit from the work they do, that will also encourage them to take it a bit further. And I would see it as part of the research, not as an add-on or an optional extra, but also think about how it can benefit them. Because if you go the extra mile, if you write for the media, if you do a interview, if you do a podcast, it also raises your own visibility, and it may also help you to attract future funding. It may help you to attract future students. It will also increase your recognition inside your own institution and inside your field. So the research that I've done on scientists, asking them, those who do engage, why they do it, they talk about these tangible benefits of funding and students and visibility. But interestingly enough, they also talk about some intangible or more abstract benefits. And they tell me that, science can sometimes be a very lonely job. And if I go to a science festival and I actually engage with a group of young people, with their parents, I find it really rewarding. It gives me a sense of meaning. It's wonderful to see how young people come to me after my talk and they really want to know more, and I can see that they're inspired and excited. It gives scientists a feeling of giving something back to society. And there's sort of a moral duty that they talk about, that they feel, often they are working with public funding, and the least they can do is to give back to society, to tell society what they are doing with that funding and how people can also use it in their own lives. But finding that balance, I think, can only work if you see the communication and engagement as an integral part of the research, not as an afterthought, not as something that you can do if you feel like it, but build it into your planning from the start. And also think about policy influence. Policymakers often, also read newspapers, they listen to radio, they are also online. So if you want your research to make a difference to regulations and policies, you have to engage with popular media and with other channels in order to make your work visible to policymakers. So in the end, there are some selfish, motivations. It will help my own career, but there are also some moral obligations or some moral encouragements. I do something for society. And scientists who do this usually report back that even if they were uncertain at first or skeptical at first, it becomes easier the more you do it. The more you do it, the more you become known. It's kind of a feedback loop of visibility. So every time you do something, it may lead to another interview, it may lead to another invitation. So I always tell young scientists, just start somewhere. Just find out, is there a science center in your area? Is there a festival? Is there a science week? Is there a podcast that you can join? Just offer, make yourself available, be willing. And as you do it more, in the beginning, you have to reach out and make these things happen, write for the conversation, etc. But the more you do it, the more people will know about you, and you will start getting invitations. Like I am participating in this podcast today. It's a wonderful opportunity to talk about the importance of science communication, and probably it may lead to, to other things that will happen as a result of it. And that's how it works in science communication. And it is very rewarding, and over time, it really makes a difference in your career. That would be my advice to scientists. You will be surprised to find out the opportunities and the networks that can result if you become more visible and if you become more engaged. Of course, I should not forget to mention that an important part of engagement and listening to society is that you can also get input from society that can enrich your research, that can actually increase the quality of your research, that can help you to ask better questions, that can help you to anticipate why there may be public concerns or public opposition. So in the end, it's about being a better researcher. That would be my final thing. It's being a better researcher if you're engaged with society.
Thank you very much. It was so interesting and informative. Science communication has so much to offer scientists, maybe also for them to consider it as a different career path. Looking forward to have another interview with you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the EURAXESS Smart Talks podcast.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode and can't wait to share more with you next time.
You can follow us and find more episodes on the EURAXESS portal, our social media profiles, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
This episode was prepared by hosts Daria Aksionova and Jovan Aranjelovic, editor Isar Peer, and is dedicated in memoriam of Professor Miroslav Trajanovic.